Hello, I'm Gary Stearman. Welcome to another edition of Prophecy in the News. Today, we've got a very exciting prophetic subject to speak about. Has to do with modern Egypt, and we'll be right back to talk about it. Well, we thank you for joining us today. I think you're going to be excited about a Bible prophecy that we have featured in the June 2011 edition of Prophecy in the News magazine. It's the cover story, and I'm holding this cover up, and you can see this baleful green color. And, of course, the headline is Radioactive River Nile. Wow. Bob Ulrich is with me today in studio, and Bob, we're going to discuss this modern prophecy. And also, I'd like to discuss our magazine while we're at it, because people need to know about what we do in Prophecy in the News magazine. That is to say, we've got a long tradition, a long history of studying Bible prophecy in a particular way.
Well, we do, Gary, and you've done it again. That cover of that magazine is making its way across the internet, making its way into mailboxes across America, and honestly, people are a little bit shocked, because what you're covering in this publication is not mainstream. You're not going to hear this in the secular media. You're not going to hear this from very many ministries, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but have you seen this anywhere else, this prophecy that you've uncovered?
Actually, I have not. And some years ago, I was absolutely astounded while studying Ezekiel 29, which is basically the death knell of modern Egypt. And we'll talk about how we can discern this in a moment, but it's the death knell of modern Egypt as sounded by Ezekiel. And Ezekiel talks about the river Nile. He talks about Satan, the devil, being bound into the river Nile. That is to say, the Nile has an evil connotation. And in the latter days, the river Nile is going to be used to judge Egypt in a very particular, and by the way, a very detailed way. I think once you start reading Ezekiel 29, it just sort of jumps out at you.
Well, it's a little bizarre, and
it is.
A lot of the things we talk about on Prophecy in the News are feel-good subjects. We talk about the rapture of the church, we talk about heaven and eternal life. Today, this isn't particularly a feel-good subject, is it?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, in keeping with current events in Egypt, Bob, we have, going back to February 12th, the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Now, for 30 years, Egypt has been more or less a support to Israel, Israel's southern flank. They could depend on Egypt. Anwar Sadat, Hosni Mubarak, more or less kept a peace treaty, even though they were beneath the surface, they were enemies of Israel. They decided it was in their favor not to attack Israel, and therefore they had this kind of a standoff for 30 years, which dropped out of sight as soon as Hosni Mubarak left office this year. And what we now have, Bob, is the fact that Israel could depend on Egypt, but no more. It's gone.
Avi Lipkin was here just a few weeks ago with us talking about the reaction to the nation of Israel to the overthrow of Mubarak. And Benjamin Netanyahu, let's just put it this way, he was none too pleased. This was a devastating event for Israel. I think he knew it. I think the Jewish people knew it. We see this moving, this rebellion in the Middle East now, moving from country to country to country. And all of it really has one thing as its ultimate goal: the elimination of Israel as a nation. The goal to drive Israel into the Mediterranean Sea. And here we are in the middle of a peace process. Is that what they call it?
That's what they call it.
And it seems like one nation desires real true peace. The other nations, false peace. They're interested in getting what they want in the short term, but their long-term goal ultimately is the complete destruction of Israel.
And since Egypt fell into the hands of a military junta and now into the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood, they've been funneling weapons across the southern border of Israel, up through Gaza, as though preparing for a major conflict of some sort. In other words, Egypt is going to become an aggressor. Which brings us to Ezekiel 29. I believe Ezekiel 29 to be a latter-day prophecy. And I'm going to start in verse 2 where we have this, 29:2 of Ezekiel. Son of man, set thy face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, this is directed toward Pharaoh. That happened like 3,500 years ago. There haven't been any pharaohs, but Pharaoh is a figurative term for the leader of Egypt, and it is preserved even to the modern era. And as we look at this, you can see it's intended for the modern era. Third verse says, speak and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, which hath said, the river is mine own, and I have made it for myself. Now that's a mouthful, Bob, and you know, having read this article, where I'm going with this.
I do, and the one thing that comes across to me loudly and clearly is when God says that he's against you, you better be concerned.
Yes.
And we see this throughout the Old Testament. In fact, before we came on the set today, we were talking about what happens to all these nations that are surrounding Israel that are, at this point, have to all be considered virtual enemies to the death. And when you make an enemy of God, you're taking your life in your hands, literally. And we see this here with the prophecy of Ezekiel.
That's right.
And the Nile River. And there's a little surprise. In fact, if I were living in Egypt today and I read your article, I'll be honest with you, I'd think about taking a permanent vacation.
Me
because
too.
what you're suggesting in this article and what's going to happen to the Nile River, is pretty extreme.
Now, it's very clear to us that this prophecy is a latter-day prophecy based upon the phrase uttered by the dragon representing Egypt. The dragon is locked into the Nile River, and the dragon is the spirit of Egypt. And he says, and I quote, my river is mine own, and I have made it for myself. Well, you know, if you look at the history of Egypt, going all the way back to the days of Moses, the Nile flooded annually, and it would lap over onto the banks, and then it would dry out. And what it did essentially was irrigate on an annual clock-like basis so that the Egyptians could grow crops very dependably. And they decided, the leaders of Egypt decided back actually before Israeli statehood and then moving up into the 50s, the Egyptians said, we need to control the river. We need to make it more dependable so that it doesn't flood unpredictably. We need to build a dam. And so they built a dam called the Aswan Low Dam, and then later on they built a dam many, many times larger higher up the river called the Aswan High Dam, which was completed in 1967. And when it was completed, it became one of the largest hydroelectric projects in the whole Middle East. Absolutely huge. It was completed with the help of the Russians. And waters began to back up behind that dam, Bob, and they backed up for 340 miles, which is a long, long way.
And you're referring to Lake Nasser.
Lake Nasser, it was called. There wasn't a lake there before. Now there's a lake about 25 miles wide, 320 to 340 miles in length. It is a huge lake of massive depth, in places 1,000 feet deep, all held back by the Aswan High Dam. And that's where the story begins. This is what enables Egypt to say, the river is mine and I have made it. For thousands of years the river did what it wanted to do, until the Russians built this dam, and suddenly they began to control the river.
It sounds like a prideful statement to me, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It almost sounds like something Lucifer would say. I will ascend to the, to the throne of God, and all of the I shells, found in the Old Testament prophecies. But the Egyptians, and you have to go back and I think really look at this, idolatry. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about Egypt. Now, people watching on TV, when you say the word Egypt, the first thing you think of is the Great Pyramid or tourism. But if you go back in time and you see the way Egypt worshipped idols, and then you look at the first of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt have no other God before me, I think it must have driven the Lord crazy that Egypt was an idol-worshiping nation, And then Israel, because they were in bondage to Egypt for so long, they imitated the Egyptians, and they became an idol-worshiping nation, even though they had God leading them.
Well, you know, we find here in this prophecy that God is judging Egypt by that factor of which he is most proud, the river. We find in verse 4 of Ezekiel 29, I will put hooks into thy jaws. Where have we heard that before?
Ezekiel 38.
Ezekiel 38. Well, in this case, it has to do with the dragon in the river. I will put hooks into thy jaws. I'll cause the fish of thy rivers to stick unto thy scales. I will bring thee up out of the midst of thy rivers, and all the fish of thy rivers shall stick to thy scales. And I will leave thee thrown into the wilderness, thee and all the fish of the rivers. Thou shalt fall upon the open fields. There's going to be a massive flood along the length of the Nile.
That's massive destruction right there.
This is, and if you've ever seen a map of Egypt, and by the way, in the June 2011 edition of Prophecy in the News, we have the aerial photo that shows where the population of Egypt actually lives along the river. But it says, thou shalt not be brought together nor gathered. I have given thee to be meat for the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heavens, and all the inhabitants of Egypt should know that I am the Lord, because they have been a staff of reed to the house of Israel. Now this statement is repeated 2 or 3 times. You've been a staff of reed. In other words, for a while, Israel leaned upon you for support, which was true under the peace treaty made under Gamal Abdel Nasser, Sadat, and later under Mubarak. That peace treaty was something Israel could lean on, but the Bible says it's a staff of reed, which breaks, allowing Israel to fall in a weakened condition. And as we've seen just this year, that staff of reed is beginning to break because Egypt no longer supports Israel, which is what I believe puts this prophecy into a modern context.
Well, that 30-year stalemate is now officially over.
Essentially.
Israel is preparing, by some people's words, preparing for war with Egypt, and the eventuality that there is going to be a major conflict. Of course, this has been building up for some time. And on the cover of the magazine, you talk about this radioactive Nile River, and this magazine is really something special. The article is just filled with far more information than we could cover on the program today. If you're not a subscriber to Prophecy in the News, I mean, just look at the cover of this publication. This is a little bit terrifying. And when you start to get this every month and you start to read about the prophecies of the Bible, and that's really what we're all about here. The Bible was written over 2,700 years ago in many cases. Some of these prophecies they're ancient, and they're coming to pass in the days we live in. We're seeing this more and more every day. We're following these in our publication every month. If you're not getting Prophecy in the News magazine, you're missing out on a great opportunity to really get something that comes into your home every month that requires you to think. And we were talking about this recently, how people don't think anymore. They just react to their circumstances.
Bob, I truly feel that we're onto something here with this Ezekiel 29 prophecy.
Well, this June issue of the magazine is explosive. You'll want to read all the facts for yourself and all the details, because Gary does go into laborious detail on why he feels this is a prophecy that's going to come true in the very near future. Now, tell us what's going to happen here in the future with Egypt.
Here's the thing, and when you read Ezekiel 29, everything would be, you might say, it's your opinion, it's a little dicey, maybe you're making assumptions that really don't exist just to try to see a prophecy that might be fulfilled in the latter days. But Bob, when I get to some key passages in Ezekiel 29, they jump off the page. The dragon is told, the river is told, because you have said the river is mine and I have made it, I'm going to use that river to destroy you. Verse 10, behold, therefore, I am against thee and against thy rivers, and I will make the land of Egypt utterly waste and desolate, from the Tower of Syene even unto the border of Ethiopia. No foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast shall pass through it, neither shall it be inhabited for 40 years. And I will make the land of Egypt desolate in the midst of the countries that are desolate, and her cities among the cities that are laid waste. And I could go on, but you get the picture. This is devastation. And 40 years, that's a long time for a population to be restricted. Something terrible has to happen.
That's not a normal type of destruction.
No, it isn't.
40 years to be uninhabited by man or beast. This isn't just people. This is animals too. It's vacant.
If you read the interpretation, and by the way, interpretations all the way back to the 19th century. For example, the Kyle and Delitzsch commentary on the Old Testament, first published in 1866, says there is a connection. And I'm quoting them here, Syene, that is the Tower of Syene, in the inscriptions, the ancient inscriptions, and he's talking about the Coptic Egyptian inscriptions, was the most southerly border town in Egypt in the direction of Kush, that is Ethiopia, on the eastern bank of the Nile, some ruins of which are still to be seen in the modern Aswan. And so as far back as 1866, Bob, Bible commentators were saying Syene, mentioned here in Ezekiel 29, is the same place as the modern Aswan.
So the Tower of Syene and the Aswan Dam, those are one and the same place.
One and the same thing.
Now you actually have a picture of the Tower of Syene, don't you?
Well, we discovered, this is amazing, after we've published the first edition of this article, that, and up to that point I had been associating the Aswan High Dam with the phrase Tower of Syene, until we discovered there really is a Tower of Syene. It was built at one end of the Aswan High Dam. It's 230 feet high. You'll have a picture of it on your screen. I'm holding up a page here, but we'll get a better picture for you so that you can really see it. And this tower is called the Egyptian-Russian Friendship Monument, and it's considered a tourist attraction. Huge, beautiful tower that is said to be fashioned after the design of a lotus blossom. The lotus grows in the River Nile. And so this big tower now stands at Aswan, making Ezekiel's prophecy right on the money. Now, when Ezekiel wrote this in about 575 BC, there wasn't even a gleam in anybody's eye about a Tower of Syene.
Nobody had ever heard the phrase before. By the way, that picture is actually in the July issue of Prophecy in the News, which is already off to the printer. So the June issue has the article. The July issue actually has the picture and the further commentary on the Tower of Syene, which I think is pretty incredible.
A little added inducement there. You need both the June and the July. Now, let's go on with this, because the Tower of Syene figures very prominently in this curse upon Egypt. It says, "No foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast shall pass through it, neither shall be inhabited for 40 years. Let's suppose that somebody destroyed the Aswan High Dam and released Lake Nasser. Billions of cubic yards of water, just all turned loose at once, would rush down to the Mediterranean Sea, would inundate every city along the Nile. Cairo would be underwater, flat out underwater."
Which is most of the people in Egypt live along the Nile, right?
They live along the banks of the Nile. But here's the interesting thing. It has been stated, and I have pulled a number of statements, that the Aswan High Dam is so huge that it cannot be destroyed with ordinary explosives. It could only be destroyed in the way described here by a nuclear charge, a nuclear missile. Some sort of nuclear explosion would be required to wipe out the dam to the extent that it would be fully breached. In other words, we're talking about a nuclear event here. And I want to go back to the year 2002, Bob, because at that time, a member of the Israeli Knesset by the name of Avigdor Lieberman stood up in the Knesset and said, quote, "Israel could defeat an invading Egypt by bombing the Aswan High Dam. He knew that this would require the use of nuclear force. He said, the dam could be destroyed by bombing. When he made that statement, he knew, and so stated, that this would require the use of nuclear force, since many experts have testified the dam is too massive to be destroyed by ordinary explosives. By the way, he served as Israel's deputy prime minister for many years, Avigdor Lieberman.
And he's been prone to make an outrageous statement every now and then, and that certainly is an inflammatory statement.
Well, he's not alone. Another member of the Knesset, Yigal Allon, publicly made the same statement in the 1980s. He's a Labor Party representative, which would make him a liberal. That would make him kind of a dove. And yet, he stood up and he said that it was widely known in Israel that Egypt could be stopped by bombing the Aswan High Dam, but it would require nuclear force. And he said, quote, "Everybody knows it, but nobody talks about it." Well, Bob, that's all I need to hear. To me, this puts the cap on Ezekiel's prophecy and makes it really worth reading, because we have Ezekiel 29 placed in a kind of context, which makes the rest of Ezekiel 29 and 30 very, very interesting.
There's a comment that you may not even be aware of this, but there's an autobiography that was written about Nasser. And when they wrote this autobiography, he was actually quoted in there. After they built the dam, he said, "We need to stop making war. We can't keep fighting wars because now our population is extremely vulnerable with this dam here."
Yes.
So he knew it back when the dam was built, that it created some vulnerability.
Well, I'm going to skip ahead a bit to Ezekiel 30 because we're fast running out of time. And I want to come to the conclusion of this. First of all, let's talk about context. Ezekiel 30 verses 2 and 3, "Son of man, prophesy and say, Thus saith the Lord, Howl ye, woe worth the day, for the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. It's a cloudy day, it shall be as a time of the heathen." This sets the prophecy in a time zone. In other words, the day of the Lord, or the tribulation. If you skip down to Ezekiel 30 verse 6, "Thus saith the Lord, they also that uphold Egypt shall fall." Egypt and confederates shall fall. "And the pride of her power shall come down from the Tower of Syene," that's the Tower of Aswan, "shall they fall in it by the sword, saith the Lord, and they shall be desolate in the midst of the countries that are desolate, and her cities shall be in the midst of the cities that are wasted, and they shall know that I am the Lord, when I have set a fire in Egypt, and when all her helpers shall be destroyed." Now, can anything be more plain than that?
Well, one big point there is, Ezekiel 38 predicts that at some point in the future there's a confederacy of nations that come down and are destroyed on the mountains of Israel. Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and Russia are two of the main countries. Egypt's nowhere to be found.
Bob, any final thoughts today?
Well, we're also big fans of the nation of Israel. And we see things just encroaching on tiny little Israel, destruction is coming, but there's a little surprise awaiting some of these nations who want to drive Israel into the Mediterranean in there.
I would call it a big surprise. I'll tell you what, it is an exciting time to be alive. And we at Prophecy in the News wish you a great day in the Lord, and keep looking up.
Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported ministry sponsored by our many friends across America and in your area. For your gift of $10, you can receive a special edition of our current program on an audio CD, or for a gift of $20, we'll send you our programs on DVD videos. For either order, call the 800 number on your screen right now.